Morning, guys.
Good morning.
Well, that clip we're going to see is more apropos to what we're going to see from the scriptures today than you believe. And so I want to begin with an introductory question, and that question is this: what kind of story is God telling? What's the genre that God is telling? Is it a romance? Or maybe an adventure, a comedy, a drama, a thriller, a mystery, a horror story? What kind of story is God telling? Well, while there may be elements of all these in God's story, I think the answer to that question, what kind of story is God telling, is simply this: God is telling a war story. And this story extends through all of human history, from the beginning of time to the end of time. It involves a cosmic battle between God and his family and the serpent and his family, or his seed. And it's moving forward towards a future victorious day when, as it says in the book of Revelation, the kingdoms of this world become the kingdoms of what? Our God, and he will rule forever and ever. That's a war story. God is writing a war story. And if God is telling a war story, then what that means is that we are daily living in a time of cosmic war, right? If we're in the middle of a story that's all about a war, we are not living in a peacetime, we're living in wartime. The problem with that is too many of us don't realize we're in a time of cosmic war. And as a result, we're not living, as Paul tells Timothy in 1 Timothy, as soldiers with a wartime mentality. Rather, we're living more like civilians in a peacetime mentality. There's a way to live as a civilian in peacetime that's very different than a soldier in wartime. How you think, how you act, what you do, what you don't do. Likewise, we're not fighting the battle meaningfully and effectively. Rather, too often we're unaware of it, we misunderstand it, or we just kind of dabble at it. For example, if you ask the average Christian guy, what is a spiritual battle? What do you think you'll get? What's the answers you'll get? Well, some of those answers might be, well, it's something that happens in third world countries, where they're still worshiping stone or wooden idols. Others, it's something for pastors or trained Christian experts, somebody that has gone to school and they know what to do. Others will say, well, it's something weird that requires special deliverance prayers. You hear the prayers, you pray this, and this happens, but it's just kind of a weird kind of a supernatural thing. Others, when they talk about the spiritual battle, it's something that a man feels when he's tempted to look at porn. In other words, that's the only time we're aware of the spiritual battle, is when you're being tempted to do something you shouldn't. Now again, while there's elements of the spiritual battle in all of this, is that what the spiritual battle is really all about? My point this morning is this: when we fail to understand that God's story is a war story of cosmic proportions, the spiritual battle will then not even appear on our radar screen. And if it does, we won't give it the weight that it demands. And at best, we'll begin to view the spiritual battle as an unwanted spiritual struggle that we have to somehow escape, rather than an unavoidable cosmic battle that God calls us to daily engage in. And so with that, today's thesis, what we want to focus on today is simply this: to properly understand the cosmic battle and your engagement in it and my engagement in it day after day, we must accurately understand God's larger story and our place in that. And what I want us to see today is simply this. God's story is a war story that's being told by a warrior God who picks fights, wins battles, and conquers enemies, all for the sake of his human family, whom he faithfully loves. There's a word for that, faithful love. It's the Hebrew word chesed, loyal love. And we're going to do this today in our third session in our current series, What on Earth is God Doing? Subtitled, Framing the Spiritual Battle Within the Story of God. And the strategy of this series is simply this: to connect major dots, key dots in God's larger story from Genesis to Revelation, to discover what God is doing in the world today, or what he's always been doing from beginning to end, including today, which will give to us, when we understand that, it'll give to us a transcendent hope, that our hope is about something bigger than just, I hope the gas prices go down. There's something bigger to this hope than that when we know what God is doing in the world today, and how you and I as men can be part of what he's doing in the world today, and therefore have a purposeful direction. So transcendent hope and purposeful direction. Now, last time we finished connecting the three key dots found in Genesis 1 through 11, and those dots were the Creator and his creation, found in Genesis 1 and 2, the three cosmic uprisings, Genesis 3, 6, and 11, and then the great divorce, Genesis 10 through 11. And these three dots from Genesis 1 to 11 form the prelude to God's war story. And as you look at these three dots, what you see as the prelude is that they frame the story as a battle. They frame the plot as a battle, and also they set the story's ending as a victory. So it's a war story that is going to lay forth the battle that's moving towards a victory when the kingdoms of the world become the kingdoms of our God, and he again reigns and rules forever and ever. Now, from the prelude, we learned that God made human beings, first of all, because he wanted a family. Genesis 1, Genesis 2. It wasn't because God was lonely. It wasn't because he needed something. God just wanted a family. Why? Because God is a relational God. He loves to give love and he loves to receive love. And so God creates us to be uniquely like him and to represent him in the world as his sons. But he gives us free will. He doesn't make us like robots. He gives us free will because God wants to be genuinely loved by his children. Not forced to be loved, not just it's our duty, so we have to do it. God wants to be loved, and so he gives us free will. And then he places us in his Edenic home, Eden. Remember, Eden was a small geographical location on the earth. That is where heaven and earth intersected. That was his home on earth where humankind met him. And it was there with his other angelic family. God had two families, the human family and the angelic family, and they met with God and they lived there together. And God's intention was that we would live there with him as a blended family. And he calls us, then we saw in Genesis 2 and 1, to participate in his family business of taking the glory and goodness and beauty of Eden and expanding it into all the world, subduing the world, filling the world, subduing the world with that Edenic glory. That was God's intention. And this intention, this divine plan, is what we call shalom, the way the world is supposed to be, the way things are supposed to work. This is how we were made, and this deep on the inside is what every human being longs for. It's because it's for what we were created and designed. And even though that was God's plan, and it was a good plan, the way it's supposed to be, we saw that something happened. Something happened in that prelude. Something happened that turned everything in the world upside down. so that the world was no longer a place of shalom, but it was now a place of anti-shalom. It was a place of darkness and disorder and depravity and destruction and decay and death. Not at all the way God planned it and designed it and intended it to be. And we asked the question, well, what happened? And we saw that the three cosmic uprisings in which members of both families participate caused this upside down. And those three cosmic uprisings were the fall in Genesis 3, the flood in Genesis 6, really what precipitates the flood, and then the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. The fall was the rebellion of Adam and Eve set in motion by Lucifer, two different members of God's two different families, members of two different families, that brought two things into the world: death into the world and alienation from God. The flood, Genesis 6, that precipitated the flood, was the sexual cohabitation of the angelic sons of God and the human daughters of men that produces this offspring, this hybrid offspring called the Nephilim. The Nephilim were a giant clan, they were renowned warriors, and they really were agents of chaos. And they accelerate depravity, and this combination of human and angelic being begins to threaten human identity, what human beings were created and designed to be. And then we have the Tower of Babel, and we saw that the Tower of Babel was the attempt of human beings to restore their own form of Eden, because remember, after the fall, Eden vanished. And so we want that. We want that Edenic experience. And so they are attempting to restore their own form of Eden without God. And that opens the door to idolatry and results in God dividing his family into nations. He scatters people and he forms them into nations. And if that wasn't all enough, last time we looked at Psalm 32, and we saw that Psalm 32 describes God's cumulative response to the three cosmic uprisings. He looks at the fall, he looks at the flood, and he looks at the Tower of Babel, and he says, I've had enough. And what does he do? Well, after dividing his human family into nations at Babel, God then divorces his family. Human beings were disinherited of their status as God's children. That's why we have to be adopted back into the family of God as children. John 1:12, but as many as received him, Christ, to them he gave the right to what? Become children of God. We were made children of God, we lost that status, and it's through Jesus that we're brought back into that status. But we also then saw that God then assigns to each nation one of his angelic sons to rule over it on his behalf. In other words, the nations were placed under God's sovereign rule via angelic proxy. God is still over them, but some of his different top angels, his sons, he assigns them to rule over that nation on his behalf. And that brings us this morning to the $10,000 question, and that is this. As the prelude of God's story ends, Genesis 11, the Most High God, who created human beings because he wanted a family, is what? He's now without a family. In other words, the reason he created us is because he wanted a family isn't existing anymore. He's without this human family. And so the question is this: what will God do now? Will he give up and start over? What is God going to do? Well, before we answer that question, there's another dot that we need to connect, an important dot, to more fully understand God's story as a war story. Okay? And that's this. The Bible tells us that sometime after Genesis 11, God's angelic sons, those that he assigned to rule a different nation, they become corrupt and they too rebel against God. So this is another rebellion of the angels. And we see this primarily in Psalm 82. This is what Psalm 82 says. God presides in the divine council among the angelic hosts. So this is in the heavenlies. Around the angelic hosts are there. And it's among the angelic hosts he renders judgment. So he's there with the angelic hosts and he's rendering judgment among them. And he says this, how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? You were to defend the cause of the weak and fatherless, uphold the rights of the afflicted and oppressed, rescue the weak and needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. This is what I assigned you to do. None of you know or understand. You stumble in the darkness while the foundations of the earth tremble. I have said, your gods, that word there is Elohim, and it simply means a spiritual being. God is Elohim, meaning he's a spiritual being. We are not Elohim. Why? Because we're human beings. We have spirit and body. And Elohim has only spirit. Guess what angels are? Elohim. So he says, you are Elohim. You are all sons of the Most High. You're part of my angelic family. Nonetheless, like humans, you will die. And like any other ruler, you will fall. And then he says this, arise, O God, and take back the earth. From who? From them. For you shall inherit the nations. Now, what is all this? Well, I believe that Psalm 82 is describing God's evaluation of his angelic son's assignment to rule the nations. What kind of evaluation are they getting? Not a real good one, are they? Because their rule has become socially and politically corrupt, verses 1 through 5, God says he is going to judge them with a future judgment. And what is that judgment? Well, verses 6 through 7, someday he will take away their immortality as angelic beings. In other words, human beings die, angels don't die, but because of what you did, you, he says, are going to die like a human being. Second, he says someday he will take the nations away from them and he will bring them back to himself, verse 8. In other words, because of continued human rebellion, God divides his family into geographical nations, Genesis 11. He divorces the nations and he assigns them to angelic sons to rule over on his behalf, Psalm 32. But instead of faithfully serving their father by ruling justly, by ruling the nations justly on his behalf, what do? They rebel against God, they corrupt the nations, and they face an abnormal future judgment of death. Angels are immortal. They're not supposed to die, but they're going to die. Psalm 82. But until then, and this is what I want you to get, until then, where are these beings? Well, they are the beings that exist as the false gods who enslave the nations and whom the nations worship and serve. By false, it doesn't mean there really isn't anything there. They're non-existent. It means they're not the true God. They're not the Most High God. They exist. They enslave the nations, and the nations serve and worship them. In the New Testament, they're called the principalities, powers, and rulers. Those terms, those three terms, are geographic, describe evil beings that possess geographic domain or geographic authority. And they are the beings over and over, especially in the letters of Paul, that he warns against. In fact, Ephesians 6:12, put on the full armor of God. Why? Because our battle isn't against flesh and blood, but against what? Principalities, rulers, powers of this darkness. These are these rebellious angelic sons that God says someday he is going to judge. In fact, we know when that's going to be. 1 Corinthians 15, I think it's around verse 24, it says, when Jesus takes back the earth and he once again submits all things to God and everything is under God, it is then he will abolish all principality, rule, and powers. That's when they're going to be destroyed. And all that brings us back now to the $10,000 question, and that is this. As the prelude of God's story ends, Genesis 1 through 11, God is now without a human family. And so the question, what will God do now? Will he give up on plan A, to have a human family, to live with them forever in Eden, where they will go out and serve him and extend his glory and his goodness and his order and beauty and life into the world? Or will he start over with plan B, whatever that might be? What's God going to do now? Well, I'll let you ponder on that for 5 minutes, and we'll come back and look and see what happens. Okay? We're going to continue, but before we do, if you're watching online, Steve told me that they're having problems with the internet this morning, so you may not be able to see the slides as clearly as you'd like. And so if that's the case, there's one of two possibilities here, and for you guys here too, you can do this. He is going to redo it, and so it will be online. You can look at it online, so he'll fix it all online later. But if you'd like, you can contact the office and ask Kelly for a copy of the slides, and she will be glad to do that, send an electronic copy. So for those watching online, for you guys too, that's always available for you guys if you ask her, okay? So before the break, we had the question. And the question was this: what will God do now? Given the fact that in Genesis 1, he creates human beings because he wants a family. He wants children. He wants sons and daughters to love and be loved by. But at the end of Genesis 11, we see he is now without a family. And not only that, he has divorced them, and they have alienated themselves from him. And so what is God going to do now? And the answer is found, we don't have to go very far, we just turn the page to Genesis chapter 12. And listen what Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3 says. Then the Lord said to Abram, who will later be called Abraham, leave your land and your family and your father's house and go to the land that I will show you. This is going to be the promised land, the land that God is promising to Abraham. Now, where is that? Well, if you notice down in the bottom right corner, there's and you follow that red line up a bit, there's Babylon. That's where the Tower of Babel, that's where everybody was scattered. And you follow that up to Haran, and then down west to Canaan. There is the promised land that God is saying, Abram, I want you to leave everything, and I want you to go to this land. You don't know where it is, and you don't know how to get there. I'm going to lead you, and I'm going to show you. Trust me, leave everything you know, and go to the land of Canaan. Why, God? Well, when you go there, Abram, I'm going to make you a great nation. And he says, I will bless you and make your name great. Where have we heard this idea of a great name before? Back up one chapter. Why did they build the Tower of Babel? They wanted to make what? A great name for themselves. And where did they get this idea of this great name, being a renowned man, a renowned person? Well, that goes back to Genesis 6 and the Nephilim, who were great. They had a great name. They were renowned people. So God says, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it for you, Abram. And he says, so that you will not just get blessed, but what? Be a blessing. And then he says this, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. Why? So that, in other words, it's only through you, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Remember, up until Genesis 11, there were no nations. Because of the tower, God forms them into nations. He divides the people into nations, and then he divorces the nations. But what's he doing now? He's making a new nation for what? The sake of the nations. Now here's my question. What does Genesis 12 tell us? It tells us that God has no plan B, that he only has plan A. He's not going to get rid of his human family. He is going to do something to do what? Restore his human family back to himself. And I want you to notice, immediately after divorcing the nations in Genesis 11, God now creates a new nation for himself in Genesis 12. And he says, I'm going to give you a homeland. If you're going to be a nation, you got to have a place to call home, right? He says, I'm going to make you a great nation. And just going to be a little, wannabe. You're going to be a great nation. And I'm going to give you, again, Abram, a great name. Why? And here's again what we need to see. So that through God's new nation, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. In fact, remember in Psalm 32 when he says he's assigning all the nations to his sons, his angelic sons? He says, but for me I have allotted who? Israel. Israel is my inheritance. So what's God saying? God is going to make a new nation just for himself. Again, Psalm 32. But not as an end in itself. Okay, all you people can just go away now. I got my little people, my little clique, my little family I'm going to love. He said, but rather as a means to an end. And what's the end? Through his Jewish nation, God will reclaim the Gentile nations. What's the word Gentile mean? You know what it means? Anything that's not Jewish. Anything that's not Jewish. In fact, you look in the New Testament, the gospel goes, Paul says in Romans 1, to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. It's always going to nations. You go Matthew 28, go make disciples by what? Going into the nations. Why? Because all authority has been given to me. Why? Because I've risen from the dead and I've conquered these lesser gods. And so through his Jewish nation, God will reclaim the Gentile nations and thereby restore his human family to himself. And you don't have to go far in Revelation before you see what's all seated around the throne, worshiping and praising the Lamb and the Most High God. People from every nation, tribe, and tongue. Through the Jewish nation, God is going to restore the Gentile nations that he has divorced. For example, listen to what he says in Exodus about Israel. He says, you, Israel, are my treasured possession out of all the nations, for you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. What's a holy nation? It's a nation that's set apart. For what? For God's purposes. What is a priest? A priest does what? He mediates between God and man. He represents man to God and God to man. He brings the two together. Israel is God's treasured nation that's been set apart to bring the Gentile nations to himself. I will make you, Isaiah 49:6 says, as a light for the nations, so that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth, to all the nations. How? Israel is a light to the Gentiles. In other words, Israel is God's rescue plan for the nations. It's how he is going to fulfill plan A. And so then, immediately after divorcing the nations in Genesis 11, God creates a new nation for himself in Genesis 12. How? This is what we need to remember. We see that in Genesis 15 and Genesis 17 when it describes Abraham and the Abrahamic covenant. Who is Abraham? Romans 4 talks about it too. Abraham is an old man. Remember? And his wife is an old woman. Impossible to have kids. In fact, Paul says their body is as good as dead. And what does God do? God miraculously raises up this new nation out of death in order to form his son. Why does he do it? To have a great and holy priestly nation to accomplish his cosmic purposes. And what are his cosmic purposes? Well, they are to reclaim the nations and restore people to his human family. That's what God is up to in the world. Now, what goes on in the remainder of Genesis? Well, Genesis 13 through 50 tells the story of how God keeps his promise to Abraham of increasing his family and the nation's population. They continue to grow, and how he brings them into the land of Canaan, the promised land. And by the way, how is it described? Not just any old land, but a flourishing land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And like Eden, it's going to be the place where Israel meets God and lives in God's presence. And so we have Abraham, Genesis 12 through 24. We have then the story of Isaac, chapter 25 through 26. By the way, what does Isaac mean? What does the name Isaac mean? Laughter. Why? Because when God told Abraham that he was going to have a son, Sarah was in the background. She didn't believe it could happen, so she laughed at God. And so, how ironic. And then there's Jacob, the deceiver, who wrestles with God and becomes who? Israel, who always then walks with a limp. And then Jacob, or Israel, he has how many sons? 12 sons. And out of those 12, right at the end of Genesis, we see the story of Joseph. Now, these are all the key descendants in the nation, and they were to dwell and increase and fill the land of Canaan. They were to enjoy God's blessing and presence in the land, this land flowing with milk and honey. And they were to go out from the land to extend God's light to the nations. Have you heard something like this? Does it sound familiar? These are echoes of Eden, aren't they? God still hasn't given up on his plan. So here's my question. If Abraham was to go to the land of Canaan and his descendants were to dwell, increase, and fill the land, then here's the question. How did they ever end up in Egypt as slaves for 400 years? What happened? Well, that brings us to the Joseph story, Genesis 37 through 50. The Joseph story is a transition story that tells us how Israel, that was supposed to be in Canaan, ended up in Egypt for 400 years. Now, we'll talk more about this 400-year stay in Egypt next time, but for right now, I just simply want you to see that what we see in the Joseph story is this, that it is God who providentially brings the infant nation out of the land of Canaan and into the nation of Egypt to do what? To preserve their existence, and not only their existence, all the nations' existence, during a 7-year world famine that Joseph, through God, predicts. Now, the plan was to go and be taken care of in Egypt, and then after the famine, to return to Canaan. But what's the problem? Well, they enjoy the land. They like it there in Egypt. They settle down and they remain in Egypt, in the land of Goshen, which is part of Egypt, for a period of 400 years. And what I want you to see, in spite of their disobedience, God extends grace to the nation. Listen to what Exodus 1, 6 through 7 says. In time, Joseph and all his brothers died, ending that entire generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and increased greatly, and they multiplied and they grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. And if we'd go on, their increase creates a threat for Egypt, and that's why they're put into slavery. But I want you to notice something here. Notice again the echoes of Eden. Notice, they were fruitful. They multiplied, and they filled the land of Goshen. Those are echoes of Eden, right? This is what God has always wanted his family to do. It was the mandate to Adam at creation, Genesis 1:27. Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the land. It was the mandate to Noah after the flood. What? Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the land. And now what I want you to see, guys, it's the reality of Israel in Egypt. They finally are filling the land. But again, what's the problem? It's the wrong land. Israel was not filling the land of Canaan God had given them to fill. And so what does God do? Well, God again providentially works, doesn't he? He providentially acts to uproot his family, just as he used the famine to get them into Egypt. And we'll see again next time some more reasons for that. He now providentially acts to uproot his family from Egypt to bring them back to be with him in the land of Canaan. And how does he do it? He does it through what's called the Exodus. Now, this isn't the book of Exodus. This is the event of the Exodus, of which the Exodus, the book of the Exodus, records. So what is the Exodus? It's an event, but what kind of event is it? What is the Exodus? Well, the Exodus is the key event that formed Israel's national identity. You look all through the Old Testament, they always refer back to the Exodus. It's when God brought us out of the land. That formed, and still forms today, Israel's national identity. The Exodus is the story of Israel leaving Egypt under the leadership of Moses. Exodus 1 through 17. It's the deliverance of Israel from slavery by means of 10 plagues sent from God. And the word plague in the Hebrew isn't just some natural event. The idea is it's a miraculous sign. It's a wonder. It isn't something that can just be understood, well, nature happened to do this, and then it did this. There are things that happen like this. The miraculous signs. God's hand is upon the Egyptians. And while the Exodus is all these things that I've just described, there is a deeper level to the Exodus that's important for us to see in terms of understanding God's story. You know what it is? It's this. The Exodus is primarily a war story between the God of Israel and the gods of Egypt. Okay? Listen what Exodus 12:12 says. Speaking of the plagues, I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt. Why? For I am Yahweh. Numbers 33:4. Yahweh defeated the gods of Egypt that night with great acts of judgment. It's referring to what? The Passover night. And notice, through the Passover and the killing of the firstborn, God defeated not the Egyptians, but who? Their gods. Exodus 18:11. I know now that the Lord is greater than all other gods because he delivered his people from the oppression of the proud Egyptians. What is he saying here? All we got to look at and see what happened there in Egypt, and we can see one thing. The Most High is Yahweh, not the gods of Egypt. It was a battle. It was a cosmic battle between Israel's God and the Egyptians' God. Now, again, who are the gods of Egypt? Who are they, guys? They're real. They are God's rebellious angelic sons that he originally assigned to rule over the nation of Egypt on his behalf. They corrupted the nations, they enslaved the nations, they demanded worship of the nations, and God, while he said he will judge them, they are still have legitimate rule and reign over the nation of Egypt. That's who they are. So they're real. If God is defeating gods that don't exist, that's not much. That's like me saying I can defeat unicorns. Well, yeah, that's true. But it doesn't take a lot to defeat a unicorn, does it? God is defeating real, quote-unquote, Elohim. Which means then that the Exodus is a story of a cosmic battle between the Most High God of Israel and the lesser gods, those that God created to be his servants who rebelled against him sometime after the Tower of Babel. Now, in context, the Exodus is the opening salvo in God's larger war story. Okay? If we look at Genesis to Revelation, the Exodus is the opening salvo. It's the opening battle. Here's the first battle that we see in God's war story. It's God picking a fight, and that's what he does here. The Exodus is God picking a fight, just like William Wallace did in the clip. He's picking a fight with the gods of Egypt to show one thing, that he's the Most High. It's a direct assault on the gods of Egypt through the 10 plagues. Every plague is aimed at one of the gods. And it's God's victory over the gods of Egypt for the sake of his name, for the sake of his family, and for the sake of his purposes. Now, to see all this, that this is a battle, requires a basic understanding of Egyptian religion in those ancient times. So this is ancient Egyptian religion 101, okay? Very simple. The Egyptians worshipped a pantheon of gods, or numerous gods, and the chief god, the most high in that pantheon, was Re, R-E. And who was Re? He was the sun god, okay? Now, Re, the sun god, is the god who, in creation, established the cosmic order. He's the god for bringing order to chaos. And he gives rhythm to the planets, particularly to the sun, so that they could track the sun from morning to night. That was a huge thing in the Egyptian religion. When the sun came up, the priests would open the door to their temple so that the sun could shine through, and it would pass over That was a major thing. So they depended on the rhythm of the sun, the function of the Nile. The Nile was their lifeblood. It's what fertilized. It's where they got their food, a lot of their food, the fish. And Ray was responsible for fertility of the land and their animals, the production of the animals, the cattle that they ate, and the abundance of crops. In other words, he was responsible for a flourishing land. Now, who was Pharaoh? Pharaoh was not just a king. Pharaoh was considered the incarnate son of Re. And his presence on the throne guaranteed cosmic order. As long as Pharaoh was there and you pleased him, there would be cosmic order. And there would be the rising of the sun, the functioning of the Nile, the fertility of the land and cattle, and there would be a full harvest of crops every year. And so with this, you would have a thriving nation. And that brings us to chaos. In Egyptian religion, chaos was a sign that the gods were angry or displeased with them. They weren't serving them like they wanted to be served, or they weren't worshiping them like they wanted to be worshiped. And that displeasure would manifest itself in a dysfunction of the sun. The sun would not work as it was meant to work. It would grow dark. The Nile wouldn't be what it was supposed to be. There would be death of the crops. There would be death of cattle. There would be suffering of people. There would be suffering in the land. The priests wouldn't be able to worship and serve the gods. All this came as was the idea of chaos. And when you had chaos, you had a failed land and a failed nation. Now here's my question. With Egypt's religion in mind, with all that we saw in mind, what do the 10 plagues bring upon the nation? Chaos and cosmic disorder. For example, the 10 plagues, there's blood in the Nile. That just destroys everything with the Nile. The fish die. It smells. It's bad. There was a god of the Nile who was supposed, in this pantheon of gods, who was supposed to care for the Nile. He can't care for the Nile. There's chaos. There were frogs. The frogs, the Egyptians worshipped the frogs, but there was only to be, they couldn't kill frogs. And so as they worshiped frogs, this frog god, whose presence was seen in these frogs, the frogs just kept multiplying, and then they'd die, and then what would they do? They smelled. And there was this terrible stench in the land. There were gnats and flies. And again, it just made life miserable, but one of the things that it did, I think it's the idea of the word fly can be also translated lice. It brought lice on the people. And one of the things that if you were going to serve the gods as a priest, you couldn't have any lice. You were unclean. And so the Egyptian priests, they would shave every other day, every whole part of their body, from head to toe. You know why? So that they couldn't be infected by lice. Because if you were unclean, you had lice, you couldn't go in and serve the gods. When the lice come, guess what can't happen? The gods can't be worshiped and served. The livestock die. Boils, hail destroys all the crops and people and cattle. Locusts, again, destroys everything. Darkness for 3 days. And then the death of the firstborn, including the firstborn of who? Pharaoh. Guys, we could look at a whole lot more. In fact, if you want to look and see how this all applies to the Egyptian gods, go online on the Bible Project and just type in Bible Project, the plagues, or the Exodus, and they give a pretty good picture of that. But one thing we can see is this. This brought tremendous chaos into the land, didn't it? fact, we won't take time to look at this, but Psalm 78, verses 44 through 51, describe the chaos that the plagues bring to the land of Egypt. And so here's my question. What would all this chaos and disorder brought upon Egypt by Israel's God say about the gods of Egypt? What would it say? They're false. They're impotent. They're lesser. Who is the true God? Who is the Most High God? God is. Egypt's gods are impotent to stop Israel's God and keep order in their land. They can't do it. In fact, was it the first 3 or 4 plagues? They were priests, because there was the same thing as the magicians. There we go. They were able to do what? Replicate the plagues. But notice, in replicating the plagues, what were they doing? They were bringing more of the same problem. They couldn't bring order. They could only add and cooperate with God and bring more disorder. So they're impotent. And therefore, Israel's God is superior to all the gods of Egypt. That is going to be a key theme throughout the whole Old Testament and into the New Testament. God is most high. And because God is most high, all the gods and nations should fear him, and God's people should give him their full allegiance as they serve him. Again, this follows all the way through the story of God into the New Testament, all the way today. And notice Pharaoh's response. Again, who is Pharaoh? Not just the king of Egypt, but the incarnate son of their chief god, Ra. Before the plagues, Moses says, you got to let my people go so that they can go serve Yahweh. And Pharaoh's response is this: well, who is Yahweh that I should listen to his voice and let Israel go? I don't know Yahweh, and I will not let him go. Exodus 5, verse 2. A few plagues later, he says this to Moses. In the middle of the night, he calls Moses to himself, and he says, get up and go out from among my people, both you and Israel. Go, serve the Lord, Yahweh. Take your flocks and go, and also bless me. What does he mean when he says bless me? What is he acknowledging? That Yahweh is most high. The incarnate son of Ra humbly bows his knee and confesses, Yahweh is the most high God. I need his blessing. Now, in spite of that response, you think, okay, God isn't done. And in Exodus 13 through 15, we see that sometime after leaving Egypt, it says go, and they all go. God hardens Pharaoh's heart, and in hardening his heart, Pharaoh decides, you know what? We had a good thing going here. I'm going to go bring them back and make them pay for what they've done. So he goes out with all his chariots to pursue and destroy Israel. When Israel catches sight of the Egyptians, they are alongside the Red Sea, and they're trapped against the Red Sea and the approaching army. And so they cry out to God in fear, and they denounce Moses. We should have stayed in the land of Egypt, and now you brought us here to die. And what does Moses say? Moses instructs them to stand still, stand firm, be still, and what? Watch God, what? Fight for them. God is a warrior who not only picks a fight, but ends it. Now watch God fight for you. And then he opens the Red Sea, and he cuts off the Egyptians so that they couldn't approach with this fire and smoke of his presence. And he opens the Red Sea with an east wind, and all his people, what? They go through it. And Israel all crosses safely while Pharaoh's army begins to pursue. And what happens? They're destroyed completely and totally in the Red Sea. And I like what it says there in Exodus 15. Israel sees the bodies of the dead Egyptians on shore, and they celebrate God's victory over their gods and affirm God as Most High. In fact, listen to part of Moses' song, Exodus 15. Then Moses and the sons of Israel, they saw the dead bodies, they saw this, and they sang this song to the Lord. Yahweh is my strength and song. He has become my deliverance. Deliverance from who? From Pharaoh and his armies. Yahweh is a warrior. Yahweh is his name. He has cast Pharaoh's chariots and army into the sea. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. And watch. Who is like thee among the gods, O Yahweh? What is he saying? Moses says, there is no doubt that the God of Israel is the Most High God. And the lesson of the Exodus for infant Israel, and I call it infant Israel because they're still in the process of growing. That lesson was this, that God wanted them to hold on to for the rest of their existence. The God who created and chose Israel to be his nation will always fight and win for Israel because he is the Most High God and he faithfully loves Israel as his firstborn son. Did you know that Israel is called God's firstborn? Let my son go that I might, he says to Pharaoh, let my son go that they might worship me. That's the lesson. Now this lesson invited an in-kind response to God of believing loyalty. In other words, you are faithful to us, we are going to believe that you are the Most High, and we are going to be faithful to you as the Most High. We're not going to serve other gods, we're not going to go any other way, we're going to be loyal to you, and we're going to believe that you are the Most High. That was to be Israel's response. And this lesson was to be memorialized for all generations through the Passover. You know why? Every year around this time, the Jewish people celebrate the Passover? To commemorate the Exodus of God delivering the people from the gods of Egypt and setting them free to enter the land. And as they go to enter the land, they will need to apply this lesson as they travel through the wilderness and they look at the land that was promised to them as they're ready to then go and take it. They're going to need that lesson. Tragically, however, what we're going to see is in the end, the lesson of the Exodus was forgotten by Israel. They didn't remember it. Rather than being a blessing to the nations, as God called them to be, because they forgot the lesson of the Exodus, that God is Most High and he fights and wins for his people, Israel became seduced by the nations. They went and served what? Foreign gods. They became a prisoner of the nations. What was it, in 586? They became a prisoner of the Babylonians, 728, the Assyrians. They're taken from the land into exile. And really, when you come to the New Testament, they're really still in exile. They've never really returned. Israel never returned. In one sense, they're still in exile. And not only did they become a prisoner of the nations, as they were seduced by the nations, they became, Paul says in Romans 2:24, which he quotes the Old Testament, I think it's Isaiah, a hindrance to the nations. He says, the nations blaspheme God because of you. Israel is supposed to be a blessing to the nations so that they could come back to God, they are doing anything but being a light to lead them back. And so what do we see today? Well, God is telling an epic war story. He's not telling a romance. He's not telling a comedy. He's not telling a drama, a horror story, a thriller. He's telling a war story. And this war story was foreshadowed, remember we saw in Genesis 3:15. It says there will be a cosmic battle between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. The plot began in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, when God calls Abram and he creates a new nation out of deadness to be his rescue plan for the divorced nations. The Exodus story is the opening battle, the opening salvo in the story of God, where God picks a fight with the gods of Egypt and he frees Israel from oppression to show to Israel and to all the world and to all the gods that he is most high. Therefore, he is to be feared, he is to be submitted to, he is to be obeyed. And the Red Sea victory is that which advances the plot, because now that the Egyptian army is dead, the gods of Egypt have been defeated, they are now free to go back to the land of Canaan, where they were supposed to be, so that they can now fill and increase and multiply in the land. And from the land of Canaan, which is to be a beachhead, to go out from there to be a blessing to the nations. But it won't be easy. It won't be easy. You know why? Because in their 400-year absence, Canaan, as they're going back to Canaan, has become the home of the Amalekites. Now, who are the Amalekites? Or are they just some ancient people? No. We're going to talk about this next time. But for now, you need to know who they are. They go to the promised land and they look into the land, they send the people out, and the land is full of Amalekites. Who are the Amalekites? The Amalekites are descendants of the Nephilim. And who are the Nephilim? Genesis 6. The half-breed, half human, half angel, giant clan. Renowned warriors. They're descendants of the Nephilim. They're fierce giant warriors. And they're understood as, again, as agents of chaos and depravity. And what we're going to see is they fill the land. They're everywhere in the land. They've taken over the land. These are nasty people. And for Israel to take the land and to dwell in the land, it will require that they remember the lesson of the Exodus. And what's the lesson of the Exodus, guys? God is the Most High God. Israel, the God of Israel, who chose you for himself, who faithfully loves you, will fight for you, and he will win for you. And he will keep his promises to you. If they're going to win and dwell in the land and overcome and conquer, and God is going to tell them to totally eliminate the Amalekites, they're going to have to remember the lesson. We'll see next time whether they do or not. But what about today? What do we take away today? I thought about that, and this is as I thought about that this last couple of weeks as I've been thinking about this, I began to see that the spiritual battle is something bigger. There's a cosmic nature to the battle. The same spiritual battle fought in ancient Egypt is the same spiritual battle that's raging all around us today. It's the same thing. It's no different. The enemy, who's the enemy? Well, who is the enemy in Egypt? It was the gods of Egypt, the rebellious sons of God who had been assigned and given authority over the nations and had enslaved them and the nations worship them. The enemy today is not flesh and blood, but it's the same rebellious angelic sons that still direct the nations, corrupting and enslaving their people through seduction, fear, and deception. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against who? Principalities, powers, rulers of this darkness. Our enemy is the same enemy that Israel faced in the Exodus. What's the battle? Well, it's the same kind of battle, isn't it? As in Egypt, so today, the battle is being played out in every realm of life. Think about the plagues. They were defeating the gods of Egypt. And the plagues of Egypt touched them culturally, socially, politically, economically, ideologically, and religiously. Guess what? The battle isn't just my own little personal struggle. It's coming at us culturally. It's coming at us socially. It's coming at us politically. It's coming at us economically, ideologically, religiously, through seduction and fear and deception. It's bigger than we can ever imagine. And what's our mission? Our mission is the same mission that God gave to Israel. Like Israel, we are to be lights and priests to the nation. Peter says, don't you know, church, that you're a kingdom of priests, a holy nation? Jesus says, you're the light of the world. Don't hide your light. We are to be lights and priests to the nations by representing God in every realm of life, inviting people to join his family through Jesus. We're going to say more about this when we get into the New Testament. But I want you to understand that while temptation to porn is part of the spiritual battle, the spiritual battle is not my own private little thing. It's cosmic. And it's hitting us all over. And if we're not aware of that, it will not be on our screen, and we will be overcome by it and not even know it. This is the good fight of faith that Paul in 1 Timothy 6 calls us to fight. And guys, the good fight is difficult, isn't it? It's difficult, especially when you look at it, how it's coming at us in all areas that it is today. What can you believe? What is happening? Especially when it comes at us in every direction, it's difficult. Culturally, educationally, politically, socially, economically, religiously. Every one of those realms, there is deception, there is deceit, there is seduction. To move away from God as the Most High God and his order and his beauty and his life to something different. Something that the gods, the lesser gods behind all this, are directing the nations and the people in the culture wars and all of that too. And when you're facing all this, it can get discouraging, leave you exhausted, depressed, overwhelmed, afraid, and alone. Anybody identify with that? I just know I have a hard time listening to the news now just because it just doesn't stop. It's unrelenting. You think you make one step forward, and then there are 10 steps back. So what's a man to do? What's a Christian man to do? Well, for today, we just want to end with this. Remember the story of the new Exodus as told in the Jesus event. Did you know that in the New Testament, what Jesus did on the cross and in his resurrection is inferred to as the new Exodus? Being set free from slavery of sin and darkness and the power of the devil, to leave all of that and enter into the promised land. That's the new Exodus. And what's the lesson of ancient Exodus? The God of Israel is the Most High God, who fights and wins for his people. Why? Because he faithfully loves his children. And so he says, like Israel was to have believing loyalty, you too believe that I'm the Most High and live a loyal life to me. Don't be seduced. Don't be deceived. Don't be frightened by the gods and all that they're deceiving the nations into. Be faithful. And Jesus says in Revelation, either 2 or 3, those who remain faithful to the end, I will allow you to sit with me on my throne. And what's his throne? The throne of all authority. So remember the story of the new Exodus. And as you do, remember this, that the rule of the gods has been taken away at the cross. They don't own us anymore. They don't have anything over us anymore. Colossians 2:13 through 15 tells us. We were set free to serve God as his sons. We belong to God's family. God gives us the right to become his children. We are brothers, Hebrews 9 says, of Jesus, who doesn't give help to angels, but he gives help to his brother and to us, to human beings, to sons of Abraham. And it's his loyal love that tethers us to the victor. We can't be separated from the victor, Jesus, because we can't be separated from what? The love of God. Romans 8. God is for us. Who can be against us? The one who fights for us is the one who wins the victory for us. Ours is simply to believe and be loyal. Doesn't mean that you don't have doubts. It doesn't mean that you're perfect. What it means is, in the end, that you know that God is Most High, and I want to live my life loyal to him. And so let's learn the lesson from Israel. To forget the new Exodus story in these difficult days of spiritual battle will leave us like Israel when they looked over the land of Canaan, and what did they see? The Amalekites, the giants in the land. And did they remember the lesson of the Exodus? When we forget the lesson of the new Exodus, we'll be just like Israel, wandering in the wilderness without hope and direction. Still God's people, just as Israel is still God's people, but totally overwhelmed, totally at the mercy of the enemy, totally ineffective for our God. Remember the lesson of the Exodus. And that will require, when we do, we'll know that God is Most High and that our loyalty is to him and him alone above all others. Well, next time, guys, May 9th, we'll continue with it's called the Conquest. We'll get into Exodus through Joshua, and we'll see all what happens in the taking of the land, the holy wars, some of the problems of the holy war where they eliminate everybody. How do you rectify that with the holy God? But I want you to remember that God is telling a war story and that we're living in a time of war, cosmic warfare, and it requires that we see ourselves as soldiers with a wartime mentality, not as civilians with a peacetime mentality.